Hey everybody. In this tutorial, we have a treat for you. We're really going to get our hands dirty with the Tableau Server REST API in a use case that's very real world. This has come up for me multiple times in actual consulting engagements. And the situation is, well, even in the small site that I have open here with 3 users, very often it will happen that someone leaves your organization, or in the case of poor Eddard Stark over here, is forcibly removed. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, season 1. But for one reason or another, that user no longer needs to be on the site, and you need to remove them. Maybe you want to free up a license to give to somebody else. In any case, you don't want a bunch of old defunct users hanging around in your environment. And one issue that will come up is if a user owns content, like this user does, then if you try to remove them, something that's going to happen is the site's going to say, we can't really remove this user completely because they own content, and you can't really orphan content on your server, like who would own it. Tableau doesn't know who to make the owner. And so it doesn't just by default push that ownership to somebody else. Instead, what it does is it unlicenses the user, and then the content still has this user as an owner. So just to show you what that looks like, we can go out here to the test project where some content belongs to Eddard Stark, and we can see that this user actually owns 6 pieces of content. So in this case, it'd be easy enough for us to just manually click through these 6 items and change ownership to somebody else. That would look something like this. Change owner. But maybe you have a very complex site, or you might even be looping through multiple sites and removing this user. And so it could very quickly become tedious. If you're not on a really simple dev site like I'm on here, you might not immediately know what content this person owns. So you don't really know which things to go click on to change ownership for. So that's why in this video, I want to show you how you can actually do this programmatically. And of course, what we're showing here in a Jupyter notebook, it's going to be kind of the guidelines for you. You would definitely want to adapt this to your own production environment. But we're going to walk through all the steps required so you know the logical flow of what you would want to do. This one's a pretty cool problem to solve because it touches on both the REST API and the Metadata API. So let's go ahead and dive in. But first, let's change this user back from unlicensed to the role that he had before. Let's say Explorer can publish. And the reason I want to do this is just to show you that by the time we get through all the steps we're about to run through, we will remove this user from the site, and we will get no problems with having him owning content still, and then they'll be successfully gone. So let's take a look at the code that we want to start running. So I am using, as always, in these tutorials, the Tableau API-lib library to communicate with Tableau Server, or in this case, Tableau Online. It communicates with both. If you are new to this library or these tutorials, then there is a getting started video linked in this description, which will explain everything you're seeing up here. And I'm basically just connecting to my environment, and I've plugged in all the credentials and whatnot that I need to make that happen. And I am going to store my connection in this little variable over here called con. And that's going to allow me to run this sign-in method, which is quite literally just reaching out to the Tableau Server REST API. It's using the sign-in endpoint to get us the authentication token we need to basically issue commands to Tableau Server via the REST API, and then it knows that we're an authenticated person and that it's safe to run these commands. So the first thing I want to do is really lay the groundwork here for what our logical process is going to be. we can see here that I'm going to want to query some users. So let's just hammer this out. If we want to remove a user from the site and we need to change ownership of any of their content to somebody else, then the logical steps might include getting the ID for the user that you want to remove. Since we're doing this programmatically, we're going to need to know user IDs for things like changing content ownership. Then we're also finally going to need user ID for this user that we want to remove, because you have to use that ID when you're actually removing the user. So we definitely want to get some user information. And then we not only want to know information about who we're removing from the site, we also want to know some information about who we want to take ownership of that content in their place. So that's why it's really useful to start here with this getting users information. From there, we're also going to want to query all of the content that the person we're removing currently owns. For that, you could do that using the REST API, but that would involve querying separately various content types like your workbooks, your data sources, your flows. In this case, I'm just going to limit it to those three things. Those are kind of the three primary content types that you would want to be concerned with anyways. But instead of querying those three separately using the REST API, we're actually going to use the Metadata API, and it's going to get all of that information for us in one go. So we'll see what that looks like. So let's just walk through this. We want to get information about our users, and we use the querying section of the Tableau API-lib library to get this information for us in a nice pandas data frame. So I'm looking at this information, and I can see the thing I really care about here is being able to see the username. And since I'm on Tableau Online, that's always an email address. And I can see the ID. So this is the ID that we would be wanting to use in future REST API calls. All right, so I'm going to do something fancy down here. I figure if you're putting this into production in your own environment, you're going to want to consider doing something similar to this, where you might have some kind of function that you would pass, like the user's email address that's no longer working with you, and then you could figure out from your user's information who is the user that has that email address, and then parse out their ID. So that's exactly what I do here. So we end up looking at something like, this is the user I want to remove, or at least that's their email address, and then I end up with an ID value. So if we scroll up here, we could see that the Eddard Stark user, their ID that we see here should match, let's see, 22D04. That should match the ID that we see down here, 22D04. All right, great. So that's working as expected. And then the user who's going to take ownership of the content. In my case, I actually just want to grab any administrator. For my dev environment, I only have one of those, right? So if we go out here, we look at our site users, we can see that I have one site administrator creator. But just for argument's sake, let's say that if you were running this on a Tableau server environment where maybe you have 10 server administrators, maybe you don't really care who gets ownership of the content. Maybe you don't even want to statically define that, because what if one of your admins leaves the company and then you have this in your script, this hard-coded username who's going to be receiving that content? Maybe you just want to pass it off to whichever administrator happens to come first in the list. So that's why over here I'm saying if the site role contains the word administrator, then we'll just grab that ID. And this pop is basically just popping out the first entry in the list, the resulting list of any of those administrator IDs. So the new owner is going to be somebody who has administrator privileges. And then let's move on to this next step. So to get the information about all the content that this user owns, I've come up with this metadata API query. And the way I did this is I actually went to Tableau Online or Tableau Server. You could go to this external assets page, and when you're here, there's going to be an entry point to the Metadata API GraphQL interface. So if you click on this, it's going to take you in there, and this is where you could start querying against the Metadata API and testing out your queries. In this case, for this example, I've already come up with the query, and it's pretty simple here. All it is saying that I want my Tableau users, and I've put in a little filter here that says I only care about this one user who I know I want to remove. If we were putting this into production, we'd probably want to parameterize this, but we can save that, fight that battle another day. So what we're getting here, this LUID, this is actually, you could think of this as just the ID. It's just, this is the unique identifier, and it's actually going to be the equivalent of what we see out here when we query our users, the ID field. So don't let that confuse you. Out here in the Metadata API, it's called LUID, but then in the REST API, that same thing is always the ID field that you see. So we get the username, the ID, the email, and then these little branches that I built in here, these little nested sections of the query, that's for my owned workbooks. I'm getting the ID for the workbook, the name, the project name, and then for data sources, I'm getting the same 3 fields, and finally for flows, the same 3 fields. So we just basically want to know for this user, for any workbook they own, what is the ID, the name, the project, and the same information for data sources and flows. So if we go ahead and run this, we can see that I'm getting this output over here, this JSON formatted output that's giving me the information about what all this person owns. So let's see what we do with that. First of all, I just copied the query from over here, and I pasted that into my Jupyter notebook here in a multi-line string so that it keeps the format nice. And if we really wanted to out here, we could just say, we could define as a variable this, and then pop this inside of an F string. So I want to keep it a little bit simplified for this tutorial. So maybe we can loop back at a later time and kind of demonstrate how we would functionalize all of this. But for now, let's leave that as is. And I am going to then run that query through this metadata GraphQL querying method that is a part of the Tableau API lib library. Now, if you're using Tableau Server Client instead of Tableau API lib, there's also going to be a way for you to query the metadata API. So you just have to figure out what that equivalent looks like. In my case, I'm just going to say my query results equals this metadata GraphQL query method, and then I pass in the string of text that is my query. I'm also slapping on this .json at the end because the results I'm going to get from the metadata API are going to be, it's actually going to be a server response, and then I want to access the JSON body of that server response. So I do this, and then I can see my, my query results. Now there are a couple things here that I don't really need. So these nested items, this key, it's a series of key value pairs. And so I really don't need this data element. I don't need this Tableau users element. I just need the stuff that's inside of that. So really this list here is the thing I care about. So I'm going to go ahead and access that list by hitting query results, and then I'm looking inside that key of data, and inside of that there's another key, Tableau users, and then there's a list sitting in there. All of my the results I really care about is inside that single list. So I'm going to pop that list. You can think of that as me just like, popping a bubble, and then everything inside that bubble is what I wanted to get my hands on. And so I'm going to go ahead and run that, and let's take a look at these results. And we can see here I have now an object that's a little bit more about what I care about. We have the ID for the user, we have the username, the email, and then we have this nested owned workbooks, owned data sources, and owned flows. So down here, just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm accessing this object, and we're going to go ahead and store all of the owned workbooks into a variable called owned workbooks. And then we're going to do the same for data sources and flows. So let's go ahead and do that. And now we can take a peek inside of this to see what it looks like. So at this point, my owned workbooks is a list of objects, and I have two objects inside of here. I have this one workbook that has a certain ID, a certain name, and a certain project it belongs to. And then I have a second workbook that has the same set of fields. So one thing I can do in Python is something called a list comprehension. And what this means is instead of me having to build a for loop or a fancy if statement, really all I want to do is fetch the ID out of each one of these items that's in the list. I can do this little fancy list comprehension where I say my owned workbook IDs equals, and I'm going to make a list. It's going to be my output, but the list is only going to contain those two IDs I care about, so that we can loop through those later and change the owner for each of those workbooks. And so the way you really read this is, I really just want the ID for each workbook in that owned workbooks variable. So what does that look like? It ends up looking like this. We basically just scraped out the thing that we cared about. So if we do that for data sources, it looks very much the same. We end up with a list of just the data source IDs we care about. And then we do the same thing for flows. Well, now we have three lists that we could loop through and change content ownership for. We have our workbook IDs, we have the data source IDs, and we have the flow IDs, all that belong to, well, all of them containing the IDs of content that belongs to this user we want to remove. So let's remember what the objective here is. Really, what all we're trying to do is safely remove this user from our site, but that user owns content. So we needed to find all of that content. We needed to figure out what the IDs were for that content so that now we can finally loop through all those different varieties of content, change the owner to somebody else on the server, and then we can finally say goodbye to this user. So what this looks like is we can now build a for loop, and what each one of these loops is doing is the exact same thing. So let's just focus on workbooks. I'm making an empty list of my responses just so that as I go through and I update my workbook, I can append the actual server response. So let's say I try to update one of these workbooks to change the owner, and for some reason it fails. Well, I don't want it to fail silently. I want to be able to later access this and then see what were those responses. And if they were all good, then we're good. We can move on. But if there's a problem, then we know. It's better to know. So this is running another Tableau API-lib method, which hits the Tableau Server REST API endpoint named update workbook. And what that's going to do is it's going to require us to pass in a workbook ID. So that's the ID of the workbook that we are updating. And then we're going to pass in some optional parameters, which we could see here. You could change your show tabs flag or change the project the workbook belongs to. And we can also change the owner of the workbook by passing in a new owner ID. So let's go ahead and do this. We're looping over our workbook IDs, changing the owner. Now we can loop through our data sources and change the owner, and loop through our flows and change the owner. You can see that happens all very quickly. Now we can just verify those responses. And if we go out to the Tableau Server REST API reference and we look at any of these endpoints for like update flow or update workbook, update data source, we'll see that the response code of a successful request is going to be 200. So we're all in the clear here. And sure enough, if we go out to our site and we look under Explore and we go to this test folder, all that content that used to belong to Eddard Stark now belongs to the administrator. Like if I click on Elliot Stamm over here, I can see that this is that site administrator creator. Awesome. So everything's going to plan. And now finally, we can try to remove this user. So it's the moment of truth here. Let's see if we successfully can remove this user. And we get this 204 response code. And let's see if the user is gone. So if I go to my users, sure enough, Edward Stark is no longer there. So we didn't get an error from Tableau Server or Tableau Online this time saying that, hey, this user can't be removed. They own content, so we're going to unlicense them. We can see we have 0 unlicensed users. So this is really a clean way for you to figure out if I'm trying to remove a user, first of all, what content do they own, if any? If they do own content, then we need to trigger this process of saying, okay, well, what do they own? Let's find out the IDs for that content. Let's make sure we change the owner for each piece of content, and then finally remove that user. Now out here, all this, ideally you wouldn't be running this out of a Jupyter notebook, but hopefully this gives you a feel for what that logical flow would look like if you're building your own functions, if you're building your own code and logic for making this happen and making this automated. All right, so that's it for today. This was a pretty good advanced use case of using both the REST API and the Metadata API. And if you want a free dev site like what I'm using out here, make sure you sign up for the Tableau developer program and check out the data dev challenges. Those are really good, and they'll get your hands dirty on all of these projects. So we'll make more videos along these lines in the near future. Thanks for tuning into this one, and see you next time.